listener production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with The Briefing. Over the past month, US President Donald Trump has ignored court rulings, ignored laws passed by the US Congress, and signed at least one executive order that blatantly contradicts the US Constitution. He's claimed anything he does to, quote, save the country is legal by definition, no matter what any judge says. He's fired independent inspectors of government agencies. He's lifted the ban on US companies bribing foreign governments. He's threatened to take news programs he doesn't like off the air. And on top of all that, there's the modern equivalent of book burning. Trump has forced the deletion of thousands of official government websites, scientific research papers, and information related to mental and sexual health, queer and trans people, and pregnancy. All of the US government's data on hate crimes, deleted. The government website on preventing HIV using medication, deleted. Most recently, after a meeting with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, Trump parroted Kremlin lies that Ukraine, not Russia, started the war.
Today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, but they chose not to do it that way.
What does this all add up to? Trump joked before the election about being a dictator on day one, but it is feeling less and less like a joke now.
I'm going to be a dictator for 1 day. After that, I'm not going to be a dictator. After that, I'm not going to be a dictator.
Democracy and dictatorship are not discrete categories. They're two ends of a spectrum. And there is some comfort in thinking a Western democracy like the US is permanently safe from dictatorships, because maybe then we, in our Western democracy, are also permanently safe from dictatorship. But Trump clearly has powerful fans in Australia. Exhibit A, mining billionaire Clive Palmer's new Trump-inspired political party, Trumpet of Patriots.
It's the Trumpet of Patriots. The party believes in the policies of Donald Trump, which has shown to be effective in bringing management back on track. Trumpet of Patriots will make Australia great again.
So, two questions. Is Trump really trying to turn the US into a dictatorship, or is this just alarmism? And if Trump's style of government really is veering towards autocracy, what does that mean for the rest of us? Those are big questions. So on this episode of The Briefing, we have asked Dr Sarah Walsh and Dave Levinthal to help us unpack them. Dr Sarah Walsh is an expert on dictatorship, particularly in the region closest to the US, Latin America, and a history lecturer at the University of Melbourne. Dave Levinthal is an investigative journalist in Washington, DC. Sarah, welcome to The Briefing. When people think of dictatorship, they often think of Hitler or Stalin. Are we all just being a bit alarmist to suggest Trump is turning the US into a dictatorship?
No, I don't think it's alarmist. I think we can start using the word dictatorship right now as of today. And if dictatorship is too strong for you, you can certainly say authoritarian regime without any fear. And I think we would be saying those words, and this is precisely the point, if this were Brazil, if this were Bolivia, if this were Venezuela, we would be using those terms. We would not be saying constitutional crisis. If this were Iran, in fact, the reason why I think people sort of make certain comparisons to places like China or Russia or Nazi Germany is, again, more of the result of racism and not understanding that there are lots of different versions of dictatorship. There's lots of different flavors. And I also think that when we look to kind of the extremities of dictatorship, then we can comfort ourselves to believe that what we're seeing is not a dictatorship, right? So if we take more extreme examples like Nazi Germany or Russia or China, then we can look at what we're experiencing and say, well, that's not this, it's not quite the same. But the vast majority of dictatorships tend to be kind of it's the Hannah Arendt thing, the banality of evil. They're still bad. It's bad to be in one. But maybe you're lucky and you're in one that doesn't disappear tens of thousands of people off the street for no reason at all. That doesn't mean you're not in a dictatorial regime. It just means you're in a different one than what you might expect.
One of the defining qualities, arguably, of authoritarianism is the targeting of minorities and the assertion of a very traditional sense of gender roles and sexual minorities are targeted. What is the function of some of what we've seen of like deleting websites about HIV prevention or deleting reference to gender or transgender Americans from scientific journals, which we've seen also?
Sure. I mean, on the one hand, I think there's the very obvious, like, this is because we hate these people and we want to make it as hard as possible for them to remain safe and healthy in our communities. And we want to create a scapegoat narrative that allows people to sort of channel all of their hatred and vitriol at specific individuals, even though ironically, many people might never have even met one trans person. It's easy to create sort of a boogeyman narrative. And I think in the short term, that's the point. However, particularly in this deletion of information and the insistence that certain information no longer be tracked, that's, again, should have our dictatorship bells ringing very strongly, because the control of information is a central tenet to being a dictatorship. It's one of the first things any dictatorial regime begins to do, is to go through government records and documents. And that is not only to target people to identify whether or not they're loyalists, which they may or may not be doing, but it's because the flow of information in a dictatorship is one way, and it is from the leader to the people. And so the kind of curtailing of information access, even when it seems like it's it doesn't just seem, it is life-saving, vital information for many people. That's the point. It doesn't matter what kind it is. You don't get any access to it. We have control about what you will see. And if a certain kind of population suffers health risks or even death as a result of us holding on to this information, and we don't like that group to begin with, great. That's the feeling about it.
Washington-based investigative journalist Dave Levinthal says this second Trump administration is like the first, but on steroids. He thinks it really is different this time.
Donald Trump is somebody who loves to talk about the rule of law, but has acted in practice above the rule of law as often as he possibly can. Nothing that he does in his mind is wrong. And by him going forward and just a couple of days ago, tweeting out a quote that I paraphrase, hey, it's legal as long as it's about saving the country. That was quite an ominous quote for Donald Trump to put forward in the minds of many people, certainly about half the country that is not a fan of Donald Trump, to indicate that Donald Trump is willing to do whatever it takes and do whatever he wants in order to enact his agenda to, in essence, remake the government in his own image. Already there have been some court rulings that have either put a pause on some of Donald Trump's action for legal reasons, or have just simply beat him back and said, no, you actually can't do this, which raises the big question, the $64,000 question, if you will, which is Donald Trump at some point going to begin to defy court orders? We are not there yet, but you can see a scenario happening very quickly where we as a country are going to be faced with exactly that scenario. And that's a huge uncertainty at this point.
What happens if Donald Trump ignores a Supreme Court ruling?
If he ignores a Supreme Court ruling, the conventional wisdom is that the United States will be cast into a constitutional crisis where the balance of powers between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary have become eroded to the point where the way that the Constitution of the United States set up our government has fallen apart or gone into disrepair. And then what happens? It calls into question whether Donald Trump is a president anymore. Is Donald Trump something of an autocrat at that point if he has superseded the powers of not only Congress, but the Supreme Court. It depends how far Donald Trump is willing to go in his quest to consolidate power within the executive branch. So it has always been an agreement, and it's always been just a cornerstone and bedrock part of our democracy in the United States, our republic here in the United States, that what the courts said was ultimately what went. They were the interpreters of the Constitution when there was a power conflict. And if Donald Trump throws that out the window and ignores it in a time of political peril for him, then we've got something that we've quite frankly never seen in the United States happening within our lifetime.
What has Donald Trump been doing to the media since he got into office?
Donald Trump has been running the same playbook with the media that he has always run, but he's doing it on steroids. Donald Trump loves the media on one hand, and that he craves the attention. He can never stop reading what people are writing and saying about him. But on the other hand, he loves to use the media as a bludgeon. He loves to beat the media up. He loves to tear the media down. And we've seen that in living color with the attacks that he's made on not only press organizations, but individual journalists are also on Donald Trump's menu. There have been direct attacks, such as barring the Associated Press, which is about as neutral a news organization as you are going to find, from attending events, the official government events, doing so ostensibly as punishment for the Associated Press, not just simply referring to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, which Donald Trump has now officially renamed, at least as far as the United States is concerned.
If we feel that there are lies being pushed by outlets in this room, we are going to hold those lies accountable. Nobody has the right to go into the Oval Office and ask the President of the United States questions. That's an invitation that is given. We reserve the right to decide who gets to go into the Oval Office.
And then there are also more institutional attacks and intimidation attacks. And these are coming in the form of lawsuits. We've seen this with programs such as 60 Minutes, which is a decades-old news program here in the United States, is suing CBS and its parent company for what Donald Trump feels to be coverage that was incorrect and anti-Donald Trump, but also too for smaller publications. One is called the Des Moines Register in the state of Iowa that published a poll that indicated right before the election that Kamala Harris was ahead in that particular state over Donald Trump. If these lawsuits don't ultimately cut the way of Donald Trump, he's already gotten some settlements out of news organizations to the tune of $15 million for the ABC, not Australia's ABC, but America's ABC. And that was something that sent a chill through news organizations all across America to say, whoa, are we going to have to basically spend money that we don't have in order to defend ourselves against the president of the United States? And you can imagine what the conversations would be for small news organizations that simply don't have the resources to defend themselves against those types of attacks, be them legitimate or not.
Why should regular people care if Donald Trump is attacking the media? Lots of people think that the media is corrupt and that Donald Trump should be attacking the media.
If the United States doesn't have an independent and free press, then government officials, be it the mayor of some small town all the way on up to Congress and the President of the United States, cannot be independently held accountable for their actions, for their words, for the determinations that they're making. It's going to be very difficult for Americans to understand, number one, what is going on in reality, and number two, what the ramifications of those decisions are going to be. We're at a moment in the United States right now when government agencies that have existed for decades and in sometimes centuries are being slashed and burned, in some case even closed. People are wondering what's going to be next. If all you're getting is the government's line on the reasons for why those things are happening, it is putting citizens who may have voted for Donald Trump or may have not voted for Donald Trump in an extremely terrible position to make a fair-minded, clear-eyed determination as to whether Donald Trump is living up to his promises, breaking his promises, or doing what is in the best interest of the body politic.
One of the weirdest spectacles we've seen in US politics over the past few weeks has been members of Trump's party, the Republicans, pretty obviously not wanting to confirm the president's clearly unqualified nominees for very important government jobs, like Secretary of Health, for example. But they're voting to do just that anyway. We actually did an episode in November about the wild group of people that Trump has nominated, and we'll leave a link to that episode in the show notes. But it raises the question, why does Trump want people he presumably knows are unusually incompetent for these important government roles? Sarah Walsh again.
Sometimes the hope or the feeling is that even in the kind of more circumscribed structure of a state that is run by a dictator, there will still be some people who are able to obtain certain amounts of control and power. And depending on the dictator's personality, he might not be terribly thrilled about that. And so if you put someone into an area that is a rather sensitive, important area, but he's also a complete dimwit, you can still essentially be controlling that role from behind the scenes. And there's also kind of the ever-growing reality that for most dictatorial regimes, as time goes on, what becomes more important is loyalty rather than competence. And certainly between Trump 1 and Trump 2 regimes, we've seen sort of the caliber of the people involved go down precipitously. And that's because it's already clear that loyalty is more important than competence. And the question sort of becomes, how long can you go with people who don't understand the jobs that they are supposed to be doing? And usually the way that you can ensure longevity without any real skill is implementing a significant amount of government repression of citizens.
You've argued that this Trump administration is closer to the dictatorships in Latin America than, say, in China or Russia. Can you explain what this kind of authoritarianism is?
Latin American nations are democracies just like the United States. Neither China nor Russia were democracies. So I think the Latin American cases are a lot better fit because most of the regime changes that result in a dictatorship there are out of a sense that democracy has failed in some way, that it has become sort of corrupted by outsiders, by people with special interests, by people who are identified as communists or Marxists, by people who are described as being anti-patriotic, and that in some cases that even the vote is wrong, and that when people vote and it doesn't go the way somebody expects, that indicates that the system as a whole is corrupt and is failing. Most Latin American dictatorships at least nominally say that they are still democracies, or if that they're not, that their goal is to sort of make some very strong fundamental changes so that we can return to democracy at a future date. Of course, the future date is at our discretion. And this too, I think particularly is really resonant with these ideas like that both Trump and Musk have said of how there's going to be this initial shock kind of torturous period. And then things, I guess, will be allowed to resume as normal. And so all of that is very much kind of more in line with what you would see coming out of an American dictatorship that at least nominally thinks democracy still has some kind of value to it.
That was Melbourne University lecturer in history, Dr. Sarah Walsh, speaking with me there. You also heard from US investigative journalist Dave Levinthal. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Why not share a link to this episode on your socials? And as always, hit that follow button on our Instagram page at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, just search Listener Newsroom. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.